Cities have always reflected the societies that built them, but few fictional cities inspire the same emotional response as Night City. Night City is beautiful, it's terrifying, and above all, it's overwhelming. Rather than functioning merely as a setting for Cyberpunk 2077, Night City becomes an experience. One that constantly reminds the player of their own insignificance within a world too large to fully comprehend. In the 18th century, Edmund Burke described such experiences through the concept of the sublime. For Burke, the sublime is not synonymous with beauty, because rather than producing harmony or comfort, it emerges through vastness, obscurity, terror, and power. Experiences that overwhelm our senses while simultaneously captivating us. Although Burke wrote about mountains, storms, and endless oceans, I will argue that Cyberpunk 2077 relocates the sublime into the urban, man-made environment. Night City transforms the natural sublime into something distinctly contemporary. Its overwhelming force is no longer nature but technology, capitalism, and architecture itself. For Burke, experiences of the sublime begin with an encounter that exceeds ordinary perception. He famously writes, "Whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, whatever is in any sort terrible, is the source of the sublime." What's important to note is that Burke does not suggest that danger itself is pleasurable, but rather that terror becomes aesthetically meaningful only when experienced from a position of relative safety. For Burke, this emotional contradiction of fear without immediate danger is precisely what distinguishes the sublime from simple beauty, as beauty invites closeness and the sublime insists upon distance. Then, in 1790, Immanuel Kant developed this idea further in his Critique of Judgment. While Burke primarily locates the sublime within external objects, Kant argues that the experience ultimately occurs within the human mind. And according to Kant, certain objects exceed the imagination's ability to fully represent them. As the mind struggles, perception reaches its limit. Yet reason continues beyond those limits, allowing us to conceive ideas that no image can completely contain. The sublime therefore reveals not only the greatness of the world, but also the limitations of our own perception. This distinction becomes relevant when discussing video games, as unlike literature or cinema, games do not simply present overwhelming landscapes to passive audiences, but ask the players to inhabit them. The sublime is no longer something simply observed from a distance, but develops into something navigable. The disorientation is experienced not merely intellectually, but physically via the exploration of the city itself, and this is where Night City shines. One of the most striking characteristics of Night City is its extraordinary, almost heaven-reaching verticality. The player rarely gets to experience the city from above, and instead explores via the streets, which are overshadowed by immense and intimidating corporate architecture. As the city continually redirects vision upwards, every intersection becomes another reminder of human smallness. While Arasaka Tower dominates the skyline like a modern cathedral, mega buildings rise hundreds of meters above densely populated streets. Even ordinary apartment blocks possess a scale that would be unimaginable within contemporary urban planning. This emphasis upon vertical architecture also echoes one of Burke's observations that one of the main causes of the sublime is greatness of dimension. Yet Night City fundamentally differs from Burke's mountains. Natural landscapes possess no intention, while Night City does. Every building represents economic ambition, corporate competition, and technological advancement. Power has become architecture, while the city itself functions as an ideological monument. An important distinction because Night City's overwhelming scale is entirely artificial. Nothing within the skyline exists out of happenstance. Ironically, these meticulously constructed systems ultimately exceed human comprehension as individual design decisions accumulate into something that no individual can fully understand. Standing beneath Arasaka Tower resemble Burke's travelers standing before an immense mountain. Not because the structures resemble one another aesthetically, of course, but because both reduce the observer to a point of almost complete insignificance. The player instinctively looks upward, but not in admiration, but in recognition of scale beyond human proportion. Night City overwhelms not only through height but through density. Every available surface communicates information simultaneously, and the eye rarely finds a place to rest. Burke also associates the sublime with obscurity, as he argues that uncertainty magnifies emotional intensity because imaginations naturally exceed precise knowledge. Night City achieves a similar effect through visual saturation. Paradoxically, however, the city becomes difficult to comprehend not because too little is visible, but because too much is visible at once. The player constantly receives more information than can be consciously processed. Each individual element remains understandable. Collectively, however, they exceed coherent perception. The result is a distinctly 21st century version of Burke's obscurity. Rather than darkness concealing information, overwhelming visibility produces its own form of uncertainty. The city cannot be mastered because it refuses to become entirely legible. Night City therefore demonstrates that the sublime has not disappeared within technological modernity. It simply has changed its object. The terrifying unknown is no longer the wilderness beyond civilization, but civilization itself. If Burke helps us understand why Night City's architecture inspires awe, he cannot fully explain what that architecture represents. Night City is not simply vast, but it is organized. Its overwhelming scale is the product of political, economic, and technological systems. But for us to understand what that means, we need to move beyond the 18th century. Writing on postmodernism or the cultural logic of late capitalism, literary theorist Frederick Jameson argues that contemporary capitalism has produced spaces so complex that individuals can no longer mentally comprehend them. Instead of experiencing society as a coherent whole, we encounter disconnected fragments of systems operating beyond our perception. Jameson calls this problem cognitive mapping. The player gradually becomes familiar with the various neighborhoods, but the city itself never becomes entirely discernible. There is no perspective from which Night City suddenly reveals itself. Even after my 250 hours of playtime, the skyline remains confusing and disorienting. Its architecture reflects the logic of global capitalism itself, and by using Jameson's theory, the player now has the possibility to reinterpret Burke's Sublime. Now, the system has become the terrifying object. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Night City is not its scale, but its indifference. The city rarely acknowledges the player. Shops continue selling, advertisements continue broadcasting, corporates continue operating, and pedestrians continue walking to destinations we never discover. In Night City, the individual is neither celebrated nor mourned, and whether the protagonist succeeds or fails, the city remains fundamentally unchanged. Burke repeatedly associates the sublime with power, not merely physical strength, but rather the recognition of forces against which human beings appear powerless. For 18th century readers, these forces were storms, cliffs, and oceans. But for players of Cyberpunk 2077, these forces become multinational corporations, artificial intelligence, urban infrastructure, or financial systems. The sublime has migrated from nature to technology, and this is perhaps Night City's most profound achievement. The city transforms abstract concepts into physical experience. Capitalism is no longer an invisible economic system. It has become architecture, and its values are expressed in steel, concrete, glass, and holographic light. Every skyscraper becomes a monument to accumulation. Every mega building embodies efficiency. Every advertisement reminds the player that identity itself has become commodified. The city is not merely inhabited by capitalism. The city is capitalism. Here, Kant's theory of the sublime returns with renewed significance. Unlike Burke, Kant argues that the sublime ultimately reveals something about the subject rather than the object. The experience occurs when imagination reaches its limit. We cannot fully comprehend what stands before us. Nevertheless, reason recognizes its existence. Night City repeatedly stages precisely this experience. The player can never process the city in its entirety. The city always exceeds comprehension. And importantly, this does not constitute a failure of game design. It is the game design. Night City succeeds because it remains larger than the player. The city continually escapes complete mastery and, therefore, the player occupies an unusual position. On one hand, Cyberpunk 2077 empowers the player. They become mercenaries capable of extraordinary violence, they influence political conspiracies, and they challenge corporations. Yet every personal achievement occurs against the backdrop of an urban environment that remains fundamentally indifferent. Night City grants agency only within carefully defined limits. The player may alter individual stories, but the city itself continues. In this sense, Night City becomes a meditation on the limits of human autonomy under late capitalism. The sublime is no longer found in landscapes untouched by civilization, but it emerges from civilization's overwhelming success. Edmund Burke probably could never have imagined a city like Night City. His definition of the sublime belonged to the terrifying power of nature, yet the emotional experience he describes remains strikingly familiar. Night City overwhelms and it diminishes. But it also inspires awe precisely because it exceeds the player's ability to fully comprehend it. The game transforms Burke's 18th century theory into something contemporary. The forces confronting the player are no longer natural, but technological, economic, and architectural. The overwhelming mountain becomes the overwhelming metropolis, the violent storm becomes global capitalism, and the unknowable wilderness becomes the digital city. Perhaps that is why Night City continues to fascinate players. Not because it's simply beautiful, but because it reminds us of something profoundly unsettling. Humanity's greatest creations may now be as incomprehensible as the natural world they once sought to conquer.